HR16. The vast majority of cars of this brand are equipped with a 1.6-liter aspirated engine. The power unit is marked HR16. This engine can also be seen under the hood of Renault cars with the H4M brand. In short, this is a very high-quality and unremarkable motor, devoid of obvious weaknesses. It is capable of delivering up to 200,000 mileage without a single breakdown, except that the oil will have to be changed, and it is better to do this every 10,000. But when buying a Beetle specifically with this engine, it's worth remembering its features. For example, there is a chance that the engine will start to eat oil through stuck piston rings. Not everyone can carry out a quick test by unscrewing and inspecting the spark plugs. The problem is that in order to remove the spark plugs, you will need to remove the intake manifold. True, this is more likely a service puncture, and not from the point of view of oil or intensity, but simply because of the service life of the motor. As practice shows, in most used internal combustion engines you can see wear on the threads of the mounting screws. And if you carelessly replace spark plugs on dusty engines, dust and grains of sand can get into the intake channels. And yes, be prepared for the fact that the spark plugs will have to be changed after 30,000. Also, as the engine ages, more and more questions arise about the intake tract. Oh yes, don't forget that this engine does not have hydraulic compensators. So control and, if necessary, adjustment of thermal clearances will have to be carried out every 100,000. This procedure is very troublesome and complicated. After all, if the thermal clearances do not correspond to the nominal value, then you will need to raise the camshafts and install pushers of the appropriate size. In short, when driving a Beetle with a naturally aspirated 1.6 engine, we strongly recommend monitoring the oil level, especially if it often drops. Change spark plugs only at specialized service stations, or from a very experienced technician. In addition, practice shows that when driving on the highway in severe frosts, the engine loses traction and may stall. Typically, a frozen throttle valve is to blame. The good news is that it heats up quite quickly. Well, if the car starts to start hesitantly, i.e. the starter turns as usual and the engine starts every other time and no errors are displayed, then the whole point is the burnt contacts of the ignition relay 252307996A Oregon 252307991D. The relay can be found in the common block on the right under the hood. Well, if the starter refuses to turn and clicks are heard, then it's time to check the contacts on the starter and, if necessary, tighten them. To summarize, we can say that this is a very good motor. Phase shifters serve about 200,000. The timing chain is of very high quality and does not begin to rustle until 200 to 250,000. By the way, we do not recommend running this engine at near idle speed, since practice shows that this provokes sticking of the piston rings. We also recommend that you spin the engine at least once a week until it reaches the cutoff point. MR16 DDT, an alternative petrol engine for the Nissan Beetle, also with a volume of 1.6 liters. But this is an absolutely excellent internal combustion engine, with a turbocharger up to 200 and 218 horses. It's also a pretty good engine. Yes, he is not without sin. He had problems in the first years, but they were promptly eliminated. We successfully resolved a problem where the boost and fuel pressure sensor could fall off while driving. But the appearance of a normal timing chain took a lot of time. In the first versions of the motor, the chain stretched already at 50,000, and sometimes even earlier. True, a modern chain also rarely lives more than 100,000. The MR16 DDT direct injection turbo engine, which was brought to life, ran for a long time without any problems. Its cylinder piston group is many times better than that of the previous engine, so you can forget about oil consumption. But this internal combustion engine will also have to manually adjust the thermal clearances every 100,000. Another problem you can remember is that in severe frosts the crankcase ventilation freezes, which is why oil will begin to escape through the dipstick tube. So, in severe frosts, we do not recommend short trips. HR2 DDT. In 2014, they began installing a 1.2 HR2 DDT turbo engine on the car. Under the hood of Renault is labeled as H5FT, paired with a 6-speed manual. But in our market this option can be seen extremely rarely. The engine is also not bad, but it sometimes has problems with lubricant consumption. And yes, we have already reviewed its 0.9-liter version, K9K. Sometimes on the market you can see a Nissan Beetle with a 109 horsepower turbodiesel, volume 1.5 DC. A very good motor. Before we started putting this diesel engine under the hood of the Juke, the problems with wear on the connecting rod bearings were eliminated. Also, the power unit was switched to fuel equipment from Continental. Before that, there was Delphi, which was seriously inferior in quality. This engine does not cause any particular headaches, but sometimes you can see internal combustion engines sawed off along the cylinder piston group. The particulate filter, USR valve and dual mass flywheel can easily be maintained for 200,000. What about manual transmission? Most often you can see a 5-speed mechanics, in which the backstage becomes seriously loose over time. Because of this, the clarity of the move and the fixation of the lever decreases. In addition, be prepared for the fact that the transmission fluid needs to be updated every 100,000. This will have a positive effect on the input shaft bearings and eliminate their hum, if any. In nature, there is also a 6-speed manual transmission for all-wheel drive Beetles. No problems with her either. 2-pedal Beetles are equipped with Jatco CVTs of various models. Perhaps the most common is the front-wheel drive variety, which is equipped with a JF015 continuously variable transmission. But at its core, it is a stepped variator. To expand the transmission range, it was equipped with a planetary gearbox providing 2 gears. There are also classic cone pulleys for a CVT and a special steel push belt. Speaking purely from the driver's point of view, the variator operates steplessly. But yes, it's worth adding right away that this CVT can hardly be called successful. The input shaft bearings do not really like driving with aggressive pressing of the gas pedal and will quickly hum from such treatment. If you ignore this hum, the play will lead to rapid wear of the pulleys and belt. Scratches may appear on the pulleys, the main reason being slipping and rapid acceleration on an unheated variator. To summarize, we can say that the JF015 does not like aggressive drivers and prefers to replace the lubricant after 40,000. Each technical inspection we strongly recommend checking all errors in the variator and measuring the oil pressure in it, but the all-wheel drive and turbocharged Beetle is equipped with a much more efficient JF011 variator. The main problems of this transmission were corrected long before they began installing it on Nissan cars. Moreover, the JF011 can effortlessly withstand twice the mileage of the new JF015. But at about 200,000, very characteristic problems will begin to appear. The shaft bearings fail first, then scratches begin to appear on the pulleys. So it's worth contacting the service in advance, which will save you the budget that you will need to revive the variator. But the all-wheel drive version of the Nissan Juke is a rare guest in our markets, and it is equipped with purely gasoline turbo engines. The all-wheel drive transmission is very interesting. It only has one front differential. The transfer case continuously rotates the drive shaft, which is connected to a conventional bevel gear. But in the drive of all rear axle shafts, electromagnetic clutches are installed. This is all collected in a single housing on the rear axle. To summarize, we can safely say that the all-wheel drive Beetle is part-time with rigid automatic engagement of the rear wheels. Electronics is responsible for this process. In principle, there are no questions about the quality and endurance of this transmission. The only exception is that she does not like hardcore off-road driving in the mud, since sand and moisture can get into the rear gearbox, but the interior let us down a little. First of all, problems arise with the steering wheel cable. It very often unwinds disgustingly, begins to rustle when driving, and then abruptly breaks off. This will be followed by turning off all buttons on the steering wheel, even the horn. The cable costs a lot of money. It is most likely impossible to restore the old one, very rarely, but craftsmen manage to solder it. In addition, a considerable number of Beetle owners have experienced the failure of the stove fan motor. The manifold in it quickly wears out, so it will need to be replaced, and the original spare part costs about $160. However, there are enough high-quality substitutes for a much more modest amount. Owners of Jukes with climate control often complain about problems with airflow switching. This usually happens due to the failure of the damper servomotors, or their housing may become deformed under the influence of hot air. This is a very expensive problem, since the damper rods and levers, like the block itself, cost a lot of money. In the first years of production, many owners also complained about the radio, which could refuse to read discs, stop picking up radio waves, and sometimes even refuse to turn on. The radios were covered under warranty replacement. But on cars with an engine start button, the button had to be replaced under warranty. It was tightly stuck, but all these problems were successfully resolved during the restyling, which took place in 2014. When inspecting the Beetle on the lift, first of all, pay your attention to a couple of unsuccessful places. If the engine begins to growl loudly from the exhaust, it is worth checking the exhaust system. As with most cars, the problem is a burnt-out gasket between the exhaust manifold and the exhaust pipe, and the gaskets between the muffler joints also burn out. You may also encounter the appearance of corrosion holes in the area of the rear flange of the catalyst, but the lower engine mount on the vast majority of Nissan models is not made in the most familiar form. The damper of this support can last no more than 100,000, especially if it contains a non-original spare part. If the damper has fallen off, then jerks and jolts begin to be felt while driving at low speed. In addition, with a mileage well over 100,000, a dull knock will appear in the front suspension when moving on uneven roads. Most often, the problem is the wear of the silent block bushings of the front subframe. Unfortunately, the Nissan company did not produce silent blocks separately, so if you want to install the original spare part, you will have to buy a subframe, which costs about $1,000. Fortunately, it is quite easy to find high-quality non-original silent block bushings on the market, which cost many times less. By the way, we do not recommend that you delay replacement. Otherwise, a noticeable knock will appear in the steering column. The steering cardan in a Nissan is not the most durable to begin with, and a subframe that jumps on uneven surfaces will clearly not add to its service life. There is another problem point in the front suspension, which will begin to creak and crunch over time. These are the support bearings of the shock absorber struts. The Beetle has a steel suspension. It's easy to find front control arms on sale for $150, which last for about $130,000 to $150,000. But with the electric steering rack everything is fine, but the shock absorbers will have to be replaced after 100 to 120,000 mileage. The rear suspension doesn't cause much of a headache either. But if the silent blocks of the torsion beam are heavily worn, you will need to buy a new one, which is expensive, or find non-original silent blocks. The situation is similar with the 3-lever for the all-wheel drive version. Either buy original expensive levers, or purchase non-original silent blocks.